this is Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're going over one of the other few real body mapping places that I help my students find. The first one is where your head connects to your neck, right? Where is the top of your neck? Go watch that video if you haven't yet. It's between your ears and behind your nose. The other place that we need to find is where your hip joints, somewhere around here-ish, right? The word hips we colloquially use as kind of referring to a general area. In Alexander Technique, we get real specific, and we'll dig into why. So, where do you think your hip joints are? If you're a person that can stand, go ahead and stand up and see if you can point on yourself where are your hip joints. Go ahead and pause for a second, figure it out, think about it. If you want to look at Stan as a reference, feel free. If you want to look at me as a reference, feel free. We're going to find hip joints on both in a moment. All right, so hip joints are different than when you put your hands on your hips, right? That's the phrasing that we often use. Or if you're taking like a yoga class or a dance class, the teacher might say something like, put your feet hip width apart. Well, what does that mean? That's vague. My hip joints are not way out here, nor are they up here where you can feel this thing you can kind of knock on here. That's not my hip joints either. That's the top of my pelvis. So on Stan here, this is what I can feel on myself. It's called your iliac crests, top of your pelvis there. That's these. Now granted, I'm wearing high waist loose pants today, so keep that in mind proportionally what's going on here. This is my natural waist. Your waist, your natural waist, is the point between your ribs and your pelvis. It's what goes in the most because there's nothing there. Now, Stan here, he's plastic, but he's molded from a real person. And because he's molded from a real person, he has uniquenesses and idiosyncrasies, as we all do. He has a very long torso. The reason I'm saying that is because he's got a whole lot more room in between his pelvis and his rib cage than I do. If I find the bottom of my rib cage, that's about here, there's the top of my pelvis. That's all I got. He has about triple. Stan and I are about the same height. He's up off the floor a little bit. If I put my heels at about the same height as him, we're around the same height. And he's got a triple length distance compared to me of this space at his waist. He's also built very narrow. So this is just a long, thin human being here. So on Stan, we're going to find top of the pelvis here. That's that stuff you can kind of knock on. You feel that. That's what people tend to say when they say their hip bones or someone has bony hips. It's the top of the pelvis. Your hip joints are down and in from there. So here's a way to find it. If you take your hands wide and spread them all over the front hip area, do some little bounces, you'll feel a crease, a fold between your legs and your torso. It's in roughly a V shape because your pelvis is a V shape. So we're following that line. That gives us a general idea of where, but what about in and out width-wise? Well, let's look on Stan. Again, this is where we get a little bit individual. Stan has a very narrow pelvis, and he's just built very narrow. So the distance between his hip joints is going to be a little bit more narrow than mine. But even with that, notice that Stan goes out at the sides a little bit. That's what I can feel down here. So again, on me, let's find these markers. Here's the top of my pelvis. And then if I go down and out from that, I'll feel this part of my femur. This is called your greater trochanter. I can feel that. And if I wobble my leg around, that moves. It's part of the leg, not the torso. So that's here. Your hip joint is a little bit up and in from there, where that intersects with that V we just found. So here it is. My hip joint is, as far as width-wise and height-wise, is about here. And then as far as forward-backward in space, it's about in the center of this hip area. So we'll turn Stan so you can see that. Now again, depending on proportions, some of us have more padding in the front, more padding in the back, depends on the person, but roughly in the middle-ish of around here. So that's kind of my cross section here, where my hip joint is. Why does that matter? Because if you think that you're bending at your hip joints and you're actually bending up here, what is that? It's your spine. This is relevant in a lot of different movements. One of the most obvious that people tend not to think about, but they notice the negative impacts of it, what happens when you're standing in line for a while? What did I just do there? I stuck my hip out, sure, yes. Where did I bend though, in as far as my structure? The hip joints did move, that's certainly true. I did rotate a little bit this way. The hip joint's a ball and socket joint, right? So it went that way a little bit. How did that compare to what I did up here? Where is that bend? I'll show you from the back. It's in my spine. Sticking your hip out is bending your spine. It's gonna hurt if you do it for a long time. Especially if you habitually do it the same way every time and you're sitting there for a long time, yeah, your back and your hips are gonna hurt because you're not using them in the way that this structure wants to move. What about forward-backward bending? Well, that's where we really get into sitting and standing. I'm gonna have another video on chair work, sitting and standing coming out soon that uses a lot of these ideas. But let's look at it for a minute. If I bend, not from my hip joints, if I bend from up here, more at my waist, I'm compressing myself. I'm compressing myself in the front of my torso, and I'm overstretching in this part of my back compared to where I know my neutral is. In order to keep my spine and my torso unit neutral, I bend at my hip joints instead. That includes something as simple as how do you get in and out of a chair? So, what actually bends as we go from standing to sitting? Not this, not this. Hip joints, knees, and ankles. They're almost always going to go together. If I were to bend only in my hip joints, that'd be about there. If I were to bend only in my knees, I would just keel over backwards. If I were to bend only in my ankles, it would be kind of a Michael Jackson lean sort of thing. If all three go together, I've kept my weight balanced over my feet because I'm counterbalancing what's going forward and what's going back. So right now, I'm totally balanced. Anytime you can't stop a movement in the middle of doing it, you're not in control of the movement. Unless you're jumping. But other than that, at any point, I can change what I'm doing here. Now, right now, my heels are not touching the ground. That's fine. I can't squat with my heels on the ground. I can't get down to a chair with my heels still on the ground. It's fine. So what I've done there is I've kept a soft, easeful neutral from the unit of my head to my pelvis. And I've just let it tilt until my weight is over my feet, and then I unbend in my hip joints, knees, and ankles. Now, depending on the person, you're going to be bringing different habits to that. That's one of the things that we'll talk about in a future video on chair work, sitting and standing stuff. The way that it's relevant to body mapping, though, finding on yourself and getting to know your own structure, is so that you can start to make informed decisions about how you use yourself. So my challenge for you is to work with, how do I do my basic, simple, everyday movements, like getting in and out of a chair? If you're someone who can't get in and out of a chair, think about how are you existing in your chair? How are you existing while lying down? Can you allow tilting to come from the hip joints rather than from your spine? See what happens.